The M is MARCO-BOLO, the O is Obama Next, and the D is Diversey. And the three projects are funded under the same call topic, so observing and mapping biodiversity and ecosystems with a particular focus on coastal and marine ecosystems. The aim of the Alliance is to unite the efforts, amplify the impacts of the projects by sharing progress, collaborations, but overall contributing to the conservation of marine coastal ecosystems. The projects are complementing each other by working towards common goals to drive positive change for better waters, oceans, and overall a better planet. So I want to share briefly the video. Let me just see. Okay, so this is the fifth webinar of the series, hosted by MARCO-BOLO. And today's speaker is Natalia Gallo. She's a marine ecologist and biological oceanographer at the Norwegian Research Centre, NORSE. Her research explores how climate change impacts deep sea ecosystems, with her focus on blue carbon, ocean deoxygenation, and sustainable ocean management. And today her talk will focus on mapping blue carbon in European seagrass beds using remote sensing, oceanographic data, and the new Eurocarbon database. We'll have a Q&A session afterwards, but please feel free to add your comments and questions in the chat as they come up, or simply just raise your hand at the end. So over to you, Natalia, whenever you're ready.
Yeah, thank you very much for the introduction and the opportunity to present some of our work. Just share my slides here. Okay. Yeah, so hopefully it's all full screen now for you and you can see them clearly.
Perfect.
Great. Yes, well, as you said in your introduction, usually I work in a much deeper water ecosystem. So MARCO-BOLO brought me quite shallow for this work. But the research that I'm working on is mapping blue carbon ecosystems in European seagrass beds. And move forward here. But just briefly to say a few words about MARCO-BOLO and how this task fits within the MARCO-BOLO objectives. So MARCO-BOLO is coordinated by Nicholas Pada at EMBRC. And the goal of MARCO-BOLO is to really strengthen our coastal marine and freshwater biodiversity observing systems in order to support decision making. Some of those objectives, as with all of these Horizon EU projects, there are many objectives, but specifically our work fits into the objective of testing and advancing new tools, technologies, and models in order to be able to provide better guidance for European policymaker needs. MARCO-BOLO is composed of 28 different partner organizations working together from 14 countries. And the task today is led by NORSE, where I'm working. And so I'm working on it with my colleagues Richard Sanders, Catalin Blix, and Jörg Harpainter on this work. And we're collaborating very closely with our colleagues at CMAR, represented by Sylvia Chimello and Isabel Sousa Pinto on this work. And then more recently, we've also started collaborating with our colleagues at LifeWatch ERIC in order to actually put the outcomes of our analysis into a virtual research environment so that others can use the outputs of our models for their own information and guidance as they need. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. Our work fits into work package 5 of Marco Polo, which is focused on modeling and mapping coastal and marine biodiversity. Specifically, we're looking at how large-scale data products, including remote sensing data products, can contribute to blue carbon mapping. And this work is actually already available on the Marco Bolo website. So we recently submitted our deliverable for this task, which is a scientific document describing the potential for satellite remote sensing to estimate blue carbon at regional scales within European coastal systems. So if you would like to get some of the further details about the work, they're available there. But the goal is to really look at how remote sensing can contribute to supporting European needs for blue carbon mapping. And just a few words first on what blue carbon actually is. I recently gave a talk and a colleague asked afterwards, why is it called blue? So the organic carbon is still brown in these ecosystems as well, but we call them blue carbon ecosystems because they are the marine analog to our large carbon storing terrestrial ecosystems. For example, you might think of rainforests or other forests on land. So in the marine environment, we call them blue carbon ecosystems just because they're associated with the ocean. And the three main blue carbon ecosystems that are considered actionable right now, as in there are concrete methodologies for how they can be accounted in national inventories, are tidal marshes, seagrass meadows, and mangroves. These are all true plants with root systems, and that's why they are kind of the easiest analogs to how we do carbon accounting for forests on land. And the reason why these are important is that even though they don't represent a huge proportion of the world or the coastal zone by area, they sequester a large amount of carbon, specifically because a lot of times the soils of where these ecosystems occur are quite low in oxygen. And so when you get carbon into these systems, it's sequestered quite efficiently because it's not respired by bacteria and because of the low oxygen conditions. And so these blue carbon ecosystems, they store carbon kind of in two main ways. The first is actual storage of the carbon from the plant biomass that's produced by the plants. So all of these photosynthesize, and then they produce leaf matter and root matter and plant matter, and that falls into the soil and gets stored through time. But in addition to that, these ecosystems also play an important role in trapping carbon that's advecting from the surrounding coastal area. Sometimes they play an important role trapping carbon that's coming in from freshwater systems, for example, in estuaries. Sometimes they can also play a role in accumulating carbon that's coming in from the oceanic system, brought in by waves and storms. And so they have this kind of role in that they're both sequestering their own carbon, but then they're also sequestering what we call as allochthonous carbon, carbon that's transported in from the adjacent areas and actually getting trapped as these ecosystems slow that flow of water. And these particulate pieces kind of drop out of the water and get trapped in these ecosystems. So there's a large market interest now in carbon credits, but beyond just the voluntary carbon market, there are also now growing European reporting needs for blue carbon ecosystems. So for our project, we decided to look specifically at seagrass meadows as opposed to more broadly at all three blue carbon ecosystems. And the main reason for this is that, I mean, mangroves, there are some kind of some regions, but not on the European mainland, right, that contain mangroves. But basically, mangroves are not as important of a blue carbon ecosystems for mainland Europe, whereas seagrass beds are quite broadly distributed along most European coastal countries. And so here we just see a map showing the distribution of known seagrass meadows in Europe from UNEP. And then on the right, we see examples of the 5 main species that are present. Mainly in the Mediterranean, you have Posidonia oceanica. And then more in kind of northern waters, you have Zostra, the 2 Zostra species. And then Halophila is it's an invasive seagrass species that's arrived and is doing quite well in some areas. And then you have Cymodotia nodosa as well, which is not very common, but is present in certain areas. So seagrasses are quite important for Europe. And on top of just the role they play in carbon storage, these are very important ecosystems for biodiversity conservation. So they are important nursery grounds for fishery species as well as non-fishery species. They provide a lot of structure, so you have a lot of different animals that are living within this ecosystem. And so on top of their role as carbon sequestering ecosystems, they also have an incredibly important role for biodiversity. And as I mentioned, European blue carbon reporting needs are growing. So since 2013, there has been an approved methodology under the IPCC to include coastal wetlands in national greenhouse gas inventories. Um, and so these carbon stocks could be counted towards national emission targets if the areas were considered managed. And kind of this division between a managed or a non-managed coastal wetland is quite important here. Um, in 2018, the EU's land use change, and forestry regulation also allowed countries the option of including coastal wetlands in their national reporting, but this was a voluntary decision by countries. As a result, for Europe, coastal blue carbon accounting was very rarely actually implemented in the national greenhouse gas inventories. And this recent report found that no European countries explicitly included seagrass carbon in their greenhouse gas inventory. Also, we do see that blue carbon ecosystems are included in the nationally determined contributions the countries are providing to the UNFCCC, but most often this has been done in either a qualitative way or purely related to adaptation measures, not related to the quantitative mitigation targets that they set. And a lot of this is due to kind of a lack of good data that's available and countries' confidence that they can actually include these in a quantitative way. However, in 2024, the EU has an amendment now to its land use change, and forestry regulation, which now makes reporting mandatory for all land categories, which includes managed wetlands and therefore includes seagrasses from 2026 onwards. And therefore, there is a very pressing need right now for blue carbon mapping and for research looking at the potential for different tools for blue carbon mapping. Again, whether or not countries include it has to do with whether they consider these wetlands actually managed or non-managed. So that's an important distinction. But also we see that under the European Ocean Pact, there's a focus on blue carbon reserves, which also requires, having data for good mapping relating to their climate and biodiversity role. And then for the EU nature restoration law, we also see that countries are required to restore degraded marine habitats, which also includes seagrass meadows as one of those habitats that are included explicitly. So the needs for blue carbon reporting and monitoring for seagrass beds are definitely growing. And there's a lot of interest in how remote sensing can contribute to our mapping needs, in part because remote sensing provides us with an ability to have high quality data that's consistently available for the entire region and has the opportunity for workflows that people could adopt and then reproduce in order to have similar types of accounting and similar types of mapping across different countries. There was a really nice paper that was written by Jamie Simpson, a review paper on the potential role of remote sensing enabled proxies to estimate seagrass carbon stocks. And here I'll just show you a little bit of the kind of their overarching conclusions. But basically here on the left first, you can just see, a lot of times what we're looking at with remote sensing is what can we see? Like what can we pick out from the pixels in the images? And of course, what we can pick out has a lot to do with the actual sensor and the resolution of the sensor. So you can see much less detail in this Landsat 8 OLI image here compared to this ArboCam. But the higher resolution sensors, usually these are only available for smaller areas, or you have to kind of purchase them from commercial companies. But a lot of the work that's focused on using remote sensing for seagrass mapping has really focused on the mapping of the seagrass habitat. And our sister project, Obama Next, has a really excellent work package on that. And they're doing really innovative and interesting work on kind of having very good workflows for mapping seagrasses. So for our work, we didn't want to do that because a lot of that we felt like that was already being handled quite well in our sister project. So then when we look at, okay, what has been proposed here as how remote sensing can contribute to blue carbon mapping? I mean, so here we can see that, okay, these are the different proxy variables that matter for carbon storage, basically. So here we have the spatial arrangement, where we can see that carbon stock increases in continuous connected meadows and is lower in fragmented and disconnected meadows. And so here the proposal is that you can calculate landscape ecology metrics using remote sensing, again, from the visual optical information from those seagrass beds. Additionally, remote sensing can contribute to an understanding of temporal variability. So we find higher carbon stocks in persistent and long-lived seagrass meadows compared to these transitory short-lived meadows. So again, because you have these satellites collecting data, you can get these time series and look at temporal variability, again, from the images that you can get from the satellites. Additionally, we see that there are some differences in carbon storage that relate to the species, as well as the kind of the attributes, the characteristics of this species. So when you have large species with high complexity canopies, you end up with higher carbon stocks. And again, satellite remote sensing can contribute to being able to understand the characteristics of the species present, especially if you have hyperspectral satellites that are and data available. Additionally, you can use remote sensing to get an estimate of above ground biomass. And generally, there's an estimate that in seagrass meadows where you have higher above ground biomass, you also have higher carbon stocks. However, we were quite interested in this white part of the pie, which was that satellite remote sensing cannot really contribute to these other important variables that give rise to differences in carbon stock. And these relate to the sediment characteristics and dynamics, the local environmental context, and then the lochthanous versus autochthonous contribution. So we wanted to see if there was anything that could be contributed in this white side of the pie. We also wanted to bring up the point that in seagrass beds especially, most of the organic carbon is actually stored in the sediments and not in the plant biomass. Again, these are compared to mangroves, compared to, big trees, even compared to salt marshes, for example, seagrasses generally are quite small in terms of their plant biomass contribution. And so because of that, most of the organic carbon is really getting stored in the sediments themselves. And some recent research from Felgate et al. 2024 actually found that there was a complete lack of a relationship between above ground canopy cover that they obtained from field observations and below ground either organic carbon content, uh, no matter which way you measured it, whether you looked at it in terms of content, concentration, or stock. So basically, the assumption that above ground biomass will always be a good proxy for actual organic carbon stock in the sediment is not very well founded, at least not for all areas. And so, especially for that reason, we wanted to focus our analysis on looking at below ground organic carbon stocks. And so our approach here was to identify readily available European-wide data products that could provide key environmental information of organic carbon storage drivers in seagrass beds. So we started with an extensive literature review on what was known about different environmental conditions that give rise to different organic carbon storage in seagrass beds. And then we looked at what are the readily accessible data products that are available that may capture information about those types of environmental variables. And we looked specifically at data that was available through NASA, through Copernicus, and through EMODNet. And then in order to actually test whether any of these environmental predictor variables are effective at being able to explain variance in organic carbon storage, we needed a database that actually had information on organic carbon storage in European seagrass beds. And conveniently, there was already a database kind of in the works as we started working on this project. And so we were able to contribute to that and use that for our analysis. But the goal is to see kind of which of these readily available large-scale oceanographic and remote sensing data products are able to explain variance in existing differences in organic carbon storage in European seagrass beds, test that through a range of different modeling approaches, and then basically identify a model that can allow us to estimate organic carbon stocks in seagrass beds based on location information. So here, just briefly, is an example of the different environmental factors that are known to give differences in carbon storage in seagrass beds. Again, I briefly discussed these earlier, but we see that there are differences relating to the species that are present. Large species like Posidonia oceanica are known to store a lot more carbon than smaller species like some of the, like Zostra noltii, for example. Similarly, there are differences relating to the canopy complexity, the seagrass landscape, and the biotic interactions, but these were not really variables that we were able to have any proxies for based on these large oceanographic data products. So then we're looking at some of the abiotic characteristics. We see that in general, there's an expectation that more exposed seagrass beds will have lower carbon storage than more sheltered seagrass beds. There's an expectation that turbid water will have lower organic carbon storage than clear water, but you can get additional deposition from molybdenous carbon in these areas. There's also an expectation that water depth affects carbon storage in seagrass beds. That nutrient availability can change carbon storage in seagrass beds. Basically, you have kind of this moderate nutrient availability has like the highest carbon storage because in excessive cases, you have an unhealthy seagrass bed, and in limited cases, you have a less productive seagrass bed. And then also there are some hypotheses relating to the climatic region and how that affects carbon storage, though generally this is still something that's being looked at. So we were trying to look at which different data products we could get that would help us look at some aspects of the environmental conditions that might matter for seagrass bed carbon storage. And so first we went to NASA and looked at their ocean color data products. These are available as already processed data sets. And so we used a data set from Sentinel-3. And basically, for our analysis, we assumed that since we're looking at these kind of long-term conditions of carbon storage, we would use the full time period available for each of these data products. So we're making an assumption in our analysis that the down core carbon storage is a function of long-term environmental conditions because carbon storage in the sediment is a relatively slow accumulation process. And so from NASA, from Sentinel-3, we decided to look at these 6 remote sensing potential predictor variables. All have to do with either kind of turbidity in the water or measurements related to the amount of chlorophyll concentration. So we have the diffuse attenuation coefficient, which is a proxy for water clarity and particle presence. So when we have high values of this, it indicates a more turbid environment. We have particulate backscatter at 443 nanometers. This is a proxy for the amount of particulate organic carbon in the water. We have remote sensing reflectance at 620 nanometers, which is basically reflected red light. And when you have higher values of this, it indicates the presence of suspended sediments. We also have kind of the CDOM variable. This is kind of blue light, and differences in the absorption of this indicate concentrations of dissolved organic matter in the water. And so it's a good proxy for elevated amounts of organic matter detritus. Then we have remote sensing reflectance at 443 nanometers. This is reflected blue light, and generally this is a good proxy for how much phytoplankton you have in the water. It's generally close to the chlorophyll A product, which is our last product. And again, this is used as a proxy for phytoplankton concentration and productivity. Then we went and we looked through Copernicus, and we identified a few key data sets that we felt would have relevant environmental predictor variables. So we identified the global ocean physics reanalysis, the global ocean waves reanalysis product, the biogeochemistry hindcast, the sea surface temperature and sea ice reprocess data set, this data product for sea surface heights, as well as a data product for significant wave heights and a surface ocean carbon field data product. So we started with these 7 main data products, and we looked at what environmental variables they had within them and selected these here. So here on the left, you can see which Copernicus data product they're coming from, as well as the time frame that the data product was selected for. You can see the spatial resolution of each data set, the temporal resolution of the data product, the variable that we selected to include in our analysis, as well as if we selected to include just the calculated mean of that data product, or also a calculated extreme value for that data product. Then here you can see the actual kind of name of what those variables mean. So we looked at everything from seawater temperature to salinity to the bathymetry to characteristics of the seawater velocity to the dissolved oxygen concentration, other nutrient concentrations, to carbon parameters, so pH, surface CO2, and then downward flux of total CO2, surface partial pressure of CO2, total alkalinity, and then some variables that were related to wave motion, basically. We wanted to test the hypothesis about if we're seeing that relationship with kind of a less active versus kind of more protected environments affecting carbon storage. Yeah. And then again, the data set that we used in order to actually test whether these environmental variables had any effect on organic carbon storage in seagrass beds was the Eurocarbon database. So this is a database that was just published this year. It's the most comprehensive database that's available for organic carbon storage in marine habitats in Europe. Seagrass beds are just a small component of this. About 7% of the data set is observations from seagrass beds, but the overall data set is over 60,000 individual data entries. So this is a really excellent resource for the community to have. And this was an effort that was led by MPA Europe, but I think it's a great example of collaboration across Horizon EU projects as well as other projects, because contributors to the database included partners from MARCO-BOLO, from Obama Next, from the Sea Blues project, from Sequester. So I think this is a really great example of like a cross-Horizon EU collaborative output. So what can we see in terms of availability for seagrass data from the Eurocarbon database? And here I'm showing the results from the first version of the database. There was just recently an update at the beginning of November, which has slightly increased the number of data points for seagrass beds. But so this, as of the first version of it that was published earlier this year, there were 4,233 data points of sediment organic carbon measurements from seagrass meadows in Europe. You can see the spatial distribution of the points here in the map on the left. And we can see the data was coming from contributors to the Eurocarbon database did not have to provide information on species, but for most of the data, there is species information available. So we can see that we have a lot of data from Zostra marina, from Posidonia oceanica, much fewer number of samples from Zostra knowltii and Cymodocea nodosa. A few examples of sites where there were two seagrass species present, and then very few for this invasive Halophila stipulacea. And so basically the Eurocarbon database provided us with the spatial location, which then we used to match and get all of the corresponding environmental data from the NASA and Copernicus data products that I discussed earlier. And so here you can just see an example for the variable particulate backscatter at 443 nanometers. This was one of our Sentinel-3 data products coming from NASA. And you can see, again, all of the circles are the locations of where we have Eurocarbon, seagrass organic carbon data from. And so now we've created a spatial match and pulled the corresponding environmental data point for each of those locations. And so we did that for every single environmental variable that we used in our analysis. And sometimes we had exact matches, and sometimes we had non-exact matches because of the kind of larger grid of some of these data products. And so we had to use kind of the closest available match. So you can see that in this example where these little circles with black dots, there was not an exact match available from the Sentinel-3 data product. And so we used the closest available grid point to match with that location. And you can see here that, it's that's what it looks like. This slide is showing the actual sample characteristics for these seagrass organic carbon data points from the Eurocarbon database. So for every single entry in the Eurocarbon database, there had to be information provided on the organic carbon content in terms of the percent. And so you can see here the distribution and the range of that. So, most of the samples have relatively low organic carbon percentages, but then you also have a tail of kind of more higher outlier samples. Most of the data points also had information on the carbon density. So here we went from, 4,233 samples altogether to now a slightly reduced number of 3,911 samples that also had carbon density information provided. And again, you can see the data distribution and the range there. Part of the reason for kind of this drop off in information on carbon density is that not all of the data contributors collected data on dry bulk density, which you need in order to get an estimate of carbon density. And then here you can see the distribution of the depths that the samples came from. So in the Eurocarbon database, it's not just surface samples. Organic carbon storage can, the organic carbon is stored deep in the sediment as well, sometimes even deeper than a meter in certain seagrass beds. And so here you can see the depths that those organic carbon measurements were coming from. Again, most of the distribution is within the top meter, but then you did actually have some measurements that were coming from as deep as almost 500 centimeters in the sediment. One of the components of MARCO-BOLO, which I think has been really interesting, is that there's been a very central focus in the project in making sure that the analysis doesn't go off in a direction that's not informed by the potential users of the analysis outcome. And this is quite unique because usually in science we do our scientific work and then we communicate it and then we hope that the way we did it landed appropriately with the audience that needs to use it. But in MARCO-BOLO, there's a real focus on making sure that users and stakeholders are included from the very beginning, in part through these co-production sessions and in building this community of practice. And this was really excellent because when we were working earlier on this analysis, we were able to have a conversation with potential stakeholders and users of the final product and ask them questions about the choices we can make in the modeling and the data that we're including to make sure that these choices are actually consistent with what they think is going to be useful to them in terms of the final output. And so specifically, our analysis was informed by stakeholder feedback on making sure that we use organic carbon density as our response variable, and also that we truncate the data that we're considering in our model to just the upper 100 meters of the sediment core. So we removed all of the deeper data points for our modeling. Again, I mentioned this before, but just so, and let me just check where I am on time because I don't actually see any time here. Okay, yeah, I'll speed up a little bit. So, yeah, so I mentioned that we have organic carbon percent. This is kind of the easiest information to get, but in order to get to carbon density, which is the mass of organic carbon per unit volume of soil, you also have to have information on the dry bulk density of the soil. So that's why we lost some data points because that wasn't provided for all. But then if you have that, then you can move from carbon density to carbon stock, and that's ultimately what's most useful for decision makers and for managers. And so that's what we decided we would calculate as the outcome of our modeling exercise. So again, I've walked you through most of these steps, but basically this is an overview of, the steps we actually took in working with the Eurocarbon database, preparing the data correctly, correcting compaction for some of those samples that didn't have corrected data available. And then here, this is how we were basically pulling all of those environmental covariates in so that we could work with this complete data set of organic carbon measurements and the environmental covariables in order to model. And this was the kind of the main modeling structure that we used. Again, we ended up with 3,680 seagrass organic carbon observations when we focused on this shallower depth horizon and only selected data points with carbon density information available. And we modeled organic carbon density then as a function of the mean depth of the sediment sample, these 42 different environmental predictors that we selected, and then we included a factor variable for the seagrass species, a factor variable for random core ID, because basically some of these samples were coming from the same core, but at different depths in the same core. And then additionally, we tested a regional factor variable to see if that also helped increase the model's explanatory power. And we tested a few different modeling approaches. We used random forest analysis in R. We used a generalized additive model in R. And then we also used neural network models that were implemented in MATLAB. So here I just wanted to show some of the and quick output from the random forest model. And the main point here is that actually carbon density, the model performance was improved by using carbon density as our response variable compared to percent organic carbon, despite the fact that there were actually more data points for percent organic carbon. So basically the kind of the take-home message here is that the preferred response variable by stakeholders was also the preferred response variable for model performance. And that overall variance explained, including all 42 environmental predictors and the full model structure, was quite high. So 86.81% of variance explained. These are the results of the neural network analyses. And just to kind of briefly walk you through what we did here, was that there was a large suite of candidate models that were tested using all of the predictors included, so basically the full model. Then based on the model performance and also based on looking at some of the relationships with environmental variables, we basically narrowed it down to 3 key candidate models for the neural network and machine learning analysis. And so these were a decision tree, a Gaussian process regression, and then a neural network. And here you can see that we had quite a high model performance for all 3 of the candidate models. So then we reduced those models to only include the top 10 predictor variables. And so you can see that here now with the top 10 predictor variables included. And we ended up dropping the neural network because even though it had quite high explanatory power, the relationships we were getting in terms of the fits didn't really match up to what was consistent with the literature. So we were concerned about the neural network results. So then we just looked at the decision tree and the Gaussian process regression results. And then we did a further independent testing step so these were the reduced model results, but now we left out 10% of the data set to see how well the model was able to perform. But overall, we're finding R-squared values consistently for all of our modeling approaches that are higher than 0.8, which is really exciting. So here I'm just showing the key environmental variables for carbon stocks across our 4 main models that we looked at. So again, first the random forest model, then the generalized additive model, then the machine learning Gaussian process regression model, and then the decision tree machine learning model. And the way that these environmental variables are indicated here in kind of the top kind of bold gray, these are environmental predictor variables that were identified as key by all 4 models, then in white by 3 models, then in green by 2 models, and then in this light gray just by that single model. But basically, we use this information to then suggest kind of the highest performing reduced model. And this is what we recommend using. So this is a model that includes 2 remote sensing variables, the diffusive coefficient, and then or the attenuation coefficient here, and then remote sensing reflectance at 443 nanometers, as well as a metric for significant wave height, for mean phosphate concentration, mean pH, bottom temperature, and then northward and eastward velocities, and then basically a variable for carbon fugacity, and then also the sediment depth of the sample and the seagrass species sample. And so using this information, we could then calculate carbon stocks by calculating the carbon density for a 5, 15, 25, 35, 45, 55, and onward centimeter sample, and then calculating a carbon stock for the upper 30 and 100 centimeters from this model output. Um, it was kind of interesting because we saw this slightly strange result with the mean depth of the sample, where we actually, across several models, saw that once you got to about 70 centimeters, you saw a peak in carbon storage. And so originally I thought that maybe this was some bias in the data set, but I've been looking and I haven't been able to find anything obvious. So it could be that this is indicating that in previous conditions, these seagrass beds were storing more carbon than they are today. Generally, we saw a good model fit across seagrass species. So here I'm showing the results from both here this slide and this slide from a generalized additive model using that recommended recommended reduced model. So generally we're seeing good model performance across different species included, and even the unspecified category is pretty well distributed in terms of its deviance residuals. And so we've used this model now to predict soil carbon stocks for all of the locations of the original Eurocarbon data set. And now I'm actively working on applying the model to all of the seagrass data points available from the essential ocean variable seagrass cover data set. And yeah, so this will all be submitted in a manuscript in January. So that will be available sometime down the line in 2026. But then we're also developing a virtual research environment as part of MARCO-BOLO Work Package 5 with our colleagues at LifeWatch. And basically what this will allow you to do is kind of behind the hood. It's going through a lot of the steps that I've described today, using that selected reduced model that was kind of that includes the key environmental predictor variables from this whole exercise, and then allows you to get a carbon stock estimation for the upper 30 and 100 centimeters. So basically what this looks like, working on this with Quan Pan and Cohen Gruel at LifeWatch, is that you can input the latitude, longitude, and species information of a seagrass bed in Europe that you're interested in. And then it will give you an output like this, which will give you a predicted carbon stock for that area based on the relationships that we've been able to find from training with the Eurocarbon database, and by pulling the environmental predictor variables based on the lat and long data you provide. So yeah, so hopefully this can help support some of Europe's blue carbon mapping needs. Again, this is kind of a first prototype, but hopefully by setting up the workflow, then we can continue to work on refining the model and bringing in more data as we have it available. So thank you for your interest, and thank you very much to the stakeholders who participated in the co-production sessions and informed our approach for the analysis.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Natalia. That's so interesting. And I think your talk has really highlighted the importance of mapping and how crucial it is for assessing the seagrass bed role in carbon storage, conservation, and mitigation for climate change. And of course, then to guide the protection and policy. So yeah, really looking forward to the publication and the virtual research environment. I think it'll be exciting to see. So yeah, just if you want to go to any questions, I'm not sure if there's anything in the chat, but please, yeah, go ahead, Chef. Yeah.
I'll just put hello. Very, very interesting. Yes, thank you. Couple of questions. First, I saw a similar presentation by a lady called Chloe from Plymouth, but I think she was looking for seagrass distribution rather than the carbon sequestration. And I think it's in one of your projects. I'm not quite sure how it's related. She was using artificial intelligence to try to identify areas. I mean, much the same as you. Um, Second question, are you able to get any time series?
No, because our approach is using it's basically using a calculated either average or extreme value for the full data product time series. So basically for each location, we just have one coordinated environmental data point. Could you potentially revise it in order to have it look at it from a time series perspective? You could, but I would feel very uncomfortable with the results of that, I think, because a lot of these data products, the spatial resolution is so large compared to the, very complex spatial structure of a seagrass bed that I mean, I was quite surprised in our analysis that we did actually find high predictive ability, given that there is so much variance in carbon stocks and around small areas because there, is so much spatial complexity with a seagrass bed. So I think if you add like the time series dimension on top of it, I would be very skeptical about the results. Um, yeah, I mean, I think it can be done, but would I recommend doing it? I think no. And I'm not familiar with Chloe's work, but I know that Chloe Figueroa from MBA helped host the co-production session that we had done
Yeah, that
earlier
was
this
the
year
Chloe.
about this. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
but I'm not familiar with her work. But I know there's really great mapping work and spatial distribution work that's happening in these Sister Horizon EU projects.
Okay.
Yeah. Thanks for the question.
Thank you. So next, yep, go ahead, Fabio.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for the presentation, Natalia. And I wanted to ask, sorry if I missed it, if there was any sediment drift considered in the model.
Yes, that's a great question. And the answer is no. So that was something that we had initially considered because there are some data products from eModNet that are more related to like benthic habitat type and, some sediment type groupings. But no, we did not include that in the final model. I forget if it was because of kind of a struggle of working with some of those data sets or if it was an issue of like we felt the resolution just wasn't going to be necessarily good enough. But yeah, the answer is no, but I think it's definitely a potential. I think that some of the differences in sediment type may be captured in some of the environmental covariates relating to water motion, because when you like the characteristics of the current environment and the wave environment will contribute to if you're having a kind of a nice muddy or kind of a larger sandy environment. So some of that might be captured, but not explicitly. Yeah.
Thank you.
Right, go ahead, Archer.
Hi, this is Artur Palacz from Institute of Oceanology, Polish Academy of Sciences. Thanks a lot, Natalia, for a really great presentation. And my question sort of stems from also the last slide when you showed the research environment output. And I was wondering if it was possible, based on your work, to add any, uncertainty estimates or confidence intervals onto your results, because I think some of the users would probably appreciate that. And then my idea was maybe to consider the fact that you actually had an ensemble of different models used in your analysis. And that ensemble could probably, generate some sort of confidence intervals based on the ensemble of different model outputs. But I was curious to hear your thoughts about that. Thanks.
Yeah, I think that's a very, very good question. And it's something I've been thinking about too. And I guess the truth is that I wasn't quite sure what would be most appreciated in terms of providing an uncertainty estimate. And yeah, without a kind of a very clear understanding of like how to tackle that in a way that would be useful to people who could use that. Yeah, it basically didn't get incorporated. There's maybe some potential. This is like something that we could definitely talk a little bit about, because if you have a good idea and it's something that can be done quite quickly or quite easily, that it seems like would be useful, then it's something we could definitely include in the VRE. But we're also, kind of reaching the end of the timeline for this task. And so that was why we didn't go in the direction of having it be a multi-model ensemble. With uncertainty that's kind of coming out of the suite of models. We basically went for a simpler approach for the VRE and having it as kind of a primary prototype that could then be further improved on for future work.
All right, thanks. Yeah, that's clear.
Yeah.
Happy to chat more if you were interested. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, if you have any ideas for like good ways to communicate uncertainty that, would be simple enough and that could be incorporated with like the single model approach, I would definitely be quite keen to include something like that.
Great. Go ahead, Fabio.
For
Please.
land carbon stocks, one source of uncertainty that we also consider is bulk density. But I don't know then for sea environments how variable it is.
For dry bulk density?
Yep.
So I mean, dry bulk density that shouldn't be contributing to the uncertainty. You mean well, for the training database, it was only trained on carbon density. So the differences in dry bulk density are already incorporated in that. But I see what you're saying in that when you're applying the model to new areas, then maybe variance in dry bulk density that is, different, correlated maybe in different ways with environmental variables may not be captured there. Yeah, that's a good consideration. Yeah.
Please go ahead. You had a question? Sorry, I've lost, I think now. Well, there's a question in the chat anyway, Natalia. I don't know if you want to open it, I can read it out. But in the models, in data sets used for carbon production by photosynthetic epiphytes, was being taken into account. And annual growth performance in terms of leaf production per shoots are being taken into account since a great bunch death leaves are swept and drifted from meadows.
Yeah, so I would say that this analysis really doesn't take into account any of the above ground production. The analysis is purely based on the organic carbon storage in the sediments. Some of the relationships with production in the above ground biomass that could have been captured by warmer water temperatures being associated potentially with faster growth. So there could be some relationships there that some of that variance could be captured in our data set. But again, because our data set was just looking at organic carbon content in the sediment, I don't really think it can be used for saying very much about the above ground component and also temporal variability relating to that. basically we're making the assumption that like things in the above ground component are quite complicated and spatially complex and temporally complex. And then once you get into the soil, which is where most of the carbon is actually stored, there you have kind of that complexity reduces a little bit, which is why these larger scale data sets can still capture variance in that category, if that makes sense. We felt that like a lot of the literature really focuses on what's happening above ground, which is really ecologically interesting. But again, there's so much variability. And from like a policy perspective of needing to estimate carbon stocks, most of the data is actually in the sediment. So that's why we decided to focus on that for the analysis.
Yes, please go ahead.
I am wondering, I got my answer for the first question, but so you assume that all carbon found in the sediment around the middle area can be attained to the middle production. It's from the source of the carbon you measured in the sediment beneath the meadows belongs to the performance of the meadows performance of the carbon capture performance.
No, no, that's not an assumption we're making. And actually, we would be thank you for the question, because that's absolutely, I think, not the case. And
Yes.
and our analysis does not offer any opportunity to look at how much of the carbon is coming in from the seagrass production itself versus the role seagrasses play in trapping advected organic carbon. So this allochthonous versus autochthonous question, this analysis doesn't provide any insight on. And it's quite unbiased in terms of where the carbon is coming from. It's just the organic carbon that's in the soil of that seagrass bed, how much of it, and can we use these large-scale environmental covariates in order to build a predictive model around that and then map those organic carbon stocks. But these different seagrass beds probably have quite different characteristics in terms of the autochthonous versus allochthonous contribution.
Yeah, okay. Because the meadows are functioning as a very efficient particle traps. So they
Yes.
trap the organic particles and keep it under themselves. So, okay,
Yeah.
thank you. I got the.
And actually, I mean, to that question, I mean, we saw that there was a key environmental predictor variable that had to do with kind of wave energy, and we did not see kind of the result that there was a clear linear relationship with amount of wave energy and organic carbon storage, and we actually saw areas where there was increased carbon storage under greater wave activity. So I think it's actually showing that wave activity is contributing to bringing in allochthonous carbon and depositing it. And there's actually a beneficial role of certain kind of wave activity in bringing in carbon to these seagrass beds.
Thank you.
Super. I don't know if there's any other pressing questions. I'm just conscious of time. But yeah, on behalf of the Mod Alliance team, thank you everybody for your time and contributions and interaction. That's really appreciated, but especially to you, Natalia. Such a fantastic presentation. So thank you so much. So just a reminder, the recording will be made available on the project websites as soon as possible. And then just a quick reminder as well to register for the next Mod Alliance webinar. that'll be moderated by Obama Next. And that's going to feature their researchers, Josen Fernandez from ASTI and Mihailo Azhar from Aarhus University. And they're both going to be covering the topic of AI technology in biodiversity monitoring. And that webinar is on Thursday, the 5th of May at 11 a.m. CET. So yeah, I think Matilda's included the link in the chat to register there as well. So yeah, I hope you really enjoyed today. I know I did. I've learned so much. So thank you so much. And I'm looking forward to seeing you all at the next webinar. And thanks again. Take care.
Thanks very much.
Right.
All the best. Bye bye.